La, 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 la.
We are back. Welcome to the Leadership Launchpad Project. I'm Rob Kalwarowsky, and as always, the yang to my yin, Susan Hobson's here. Susan, how are you?
I am excellent. I'm excited for this interview and this topic, one of our favorite topics to unpack. So let's go. Let's get our people started, shall we?
Absolutely. And I wanted to start off, obviously, we always start off with a quote, and I wanted to start off one with from David Icke. And he says, when you look in the mirror, what do you see? Do you see the real you or what you've been conditioned to believe is you? The two are so different. One is an infinite consciousness capable of being and creating whatever it chooses. The other is an illusion imprisoned by its own perceived and programmed limitations.
Oh, truer
Wow.
words have never been spoken. Tell our people
Wow.
who chose that quote specifically for today's show.
Of course, we have our special guest that we'll get to just in a second. But for me, obviously, when I looked in the mirror and when we started working together, I had so many limitations. And part of what ketamine did for me was to unlock at least pieces and views into what I could be and what I could create. And I suppose in the big news of my week is something that has came out of that is I'll be speaking at TEDx Kumamoto in July this summer. And so, yes, I have to say I have to fly halfway across the world, both to get heard, I guess, and it's been 2 summers in a row. But it's amazing, and it's such an honor to join them, and I'm super pumped about it.
And I feel like your psychedelic therapy played a big role in you being able to actually step into and embody all of that we were visualizing at the start of our work together, right?
Absolutely. And on that note, we have our special guest for today, Dr. Randall Hansen, and he's the author of Triumph Over Trauma. Psychedelic medicines are helping people heal their trauma, change their lives, and grow their spirituality. Randall, how are you?
I'm doing great this morning. How are you?
I'm great. And yeah, for folks who are new to your work, obviously they can go get the book on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, wherever there's books, or they can head over to your website, triumphovertraumabook.com, which we've dropped in the podcast notes, and they
Thank
can
you.
find out more there. Can you tell us a little bit about you and how did you get here? How did you arrive on your journey of psychedelic medicines?
Well, I've learned, as many of us question what is our underlying one word that describes us, and it took me a long time, even though I've been a college professor most of my life, but I didn't really ring with educator until I don't know about a year ago, and sort of doing an exercise similar to this, and what's that one word that describes you, and looking at all I've done in my life, I said, well, educator, and this is the same role I'm taking with the psychedelic renaissance or psychedelic wave or whatever we want to call it. It's definitely coming crashing onto us into the mainstream in this year and probably next year, both. And I see my role in this space as an educator because we've had 50 plus years of propaganda and lies, are the fried egg in the pan, and who doesn't remember that visual image but and so I just felt like yes, there are others setting the record straight, and I want to be one of those that join those voices that say this might be a modality that can do some healing, and we need to be investigating it. We need to be taking the handcuffs off, and it's been happening at the research level now for especially the last decade or so. But we need to do it. We need to push it further ahead, and that's kind of my goal with this book. And I just say also that the audience, I say, for the book is the psychedelically curious, those that say, I've heard about these things, but what are they, and can they help me in some way? And Rob, your introductory comments fit that perfectly. There's so many stories of healing from these psychedelic medicines.
I was going to say, well, what's your story in terms of what inspired you to bring all of this education to this space around psychedelic therapy?
Well, I guess I'll say, first of all, with psychedelics, if you go deeply into them, it's sort of hard sometimes to talk too much about yourself. So I'll talk more about the journey. Um, and it started, I guess, about 3.5 years ago when my wife and partner Jenny we were listening to a podcast, and Jesse Gold, who is the founder of Heroic Hearts Project, which is an nonprofit that helps save veteran lives, he was telling his story about how he had gone down to the jungle in Peru and drank this brew called ayahuasca, and it saved his life, literally saved his life. And we're like, what the heck is ayahuasca?
Yeah.
Never had heard of that in my life. And that led, both of us, first Jenny and then myself, down this rabbit hole of these psychedelics. And there's a story in the book about this woman who works in the cannabis industry. And she says when she started working in the cannabis industry and saw how many lies they'd been told about cannabis, she got really mad. And then when she got into the psychedelic space and she found out all the lies, she got even angrier. And I said, yes, that's what I want. I don't want the anger, but I want that flip that narrative to talking about, yes, this is a healing modality that, these substances were all put on Schedule 1, which is the most restrictive drug classification. And according to the definition, it says these drugs have no medicinal value. And even back in the 60s and 70s, we had proof that these did have medicinal value. LSD was being used to treat alcoholism. LSD was being used for talk therapy, in addition to talk therapy. And we have all these studies that were wiped out when they were classified as Schedule 1. Oh, sorry. So my story, long story. So Jenny immediately jumped on board Heroic Hearts. She's still involved with them today. Jesse's this great guy, and they've now helped hundreds of veterans in that process. And that led us just to the education of what psychedelics are, plant medicines versus the synthetic or chemically induced medicines. And that led us on a few journeys. And then I will say that one of the last journeys I had, which was an LSD journey, people talk about in psychedelics that you get a digital download. And I'd watch documentaries and people would say, oh, yes, I was struggling with my business plan and I went to an ayahuasca retreat or something like that. And I had a digital download. I all the things I needed for my website, my app, everything. I'm like, come on. But literally, I can testify that on an late summer afternoon on my deck at the end of an LSD journey, literally the outline for this book. I had no intention of writing a book. I thought, there were pretty, enough books in the psychedelic space for people who are curious. But it was just like, no, you have to tell these stories. And the stories are going to be what help convince people that these psychedelics are healing, are helpful for spirituality, for personal transformation. And so literally I jumped up, grabbed a pad, a paper and pen, and the outline just changed slightly from what's here today. The download did include microdosing, but I do have chapters on microdosing in the book now.
Amazing. Can you tell us one of those stories?
Yes, that's exactly what I was going to ask too.
I've now seen these stories about 20 times between gathering them, editing them, talking about them, then editing the book and re-editing the book. And so, but they still, if I were to sit down and actually read one of these to you, I'd still start bawling at some point because they're that powerful. But let me give you a macrodosing example and a microdosing example. The macrodosing example is this wonderful guy named Ryan. He is a U.S. Marine. And like many of these war veterans, and really going all the way back to Vietnam, although the more recent wars have been more violent. And so anyway, he did several tours in Afghanistan, Iraq. And he came back and, like many veterans, was self-medicating with alcohol, was struggling with moral injury and PTS and probably TBI and other things. And he was just getting lost. And he luckily found, through another nonprofit called the Mission Within, he went and did probably the gnarliest, strongest medication you could ever do. He went down and did iboga, ibogaine, which is probably I would say the strongest psychedelic. You literally have to have medical staff on hand to monitor heart rate and pulse and things like that because it is that strong. And then that was followed by another psychedelic called 5-MeO-DMT the next day. And the best quote from that he said in his story is, the first days were really tough on him, but once he got over that hump, which is what happens in psychedelics, you have some challenging times where the medicine kind of shows you what you need to see, what you need to deal with. And once you kind of accept that, then it takes you to this whole other level. And his quote is, "I felt immersed in an ocean of bliss." And is that not just going, wow? And I would say in almost every story about psychedelic healing, you'll hear bliss, love, feelings I have never felt before in my life. And so so that from going from a point of almost being one of those suicide statistics to feeling this bliss and this self-love and this self-forgiveness is absolutely amazing. And then I have and microdosing is interesting. We're still doing a lot. We still have to do more research on it, and a lot of it's anecdotal, but the anecdotal stories are absolutely amazing. And this woman used microdosing to deal with her OCD. And so she was just in a constant state, these loops, and she couldn't get out. And I can't remember if she was on an OCD medication or not, but she decided to do microdosing. And a quote that I pulled from her story is that microdosing helped lift a veil of hopelessness from looping OCD. And, those who haven't experienced some of the, deep depression or OCD, and you read how these people describe the darkness or that veil of, you can just picture this heaviness sitting on them. And so, these whether it's macrodosing or microdosing, we're seeing so many stories of healing from anxiety, depression, addiction, PTS, post-traumatic stress. And the research keeps going on. They're looking at eating disorders and TBIs and so many other things. And the mental part is fascinating because we're seeing how the psychedelic substances are impacting our brains. And we really see how it works with something like OCD, because what the psychedelics seem to do is break down some of these old connections in our brain, especially ones that aren't working for us, like in depression and in OCD. And then they create new ones, which is this neuroplasticity you might hear if you hear scientists talking about psychedelics. And so I can see, it's fascinating how all these mental wellness, mental issues but when we see some of these physical things happening also, it's astounding. But then also we know that psychedelics are also anti-inflammatory. So that plays a role in helping the whole entire body system. If you want one more, because I know, Rob, you mentioned something about spirituality before too. almost all the stories have an element of spirituality in them too, from being shot into space and sitting with angels and again feeling this warmth and love like they've never felt, or I've had Jesus touch my shoulder and I just melted into pure love, and just these. Anyway, the best story in the book is actually from a Episcopal priest who was at a Johns Hopkins studies for religious leaders, and they were given 2 doses of psilocybin from magic mushrooms. And he said, I went into this, I had great faith, I had, ordained, I was totally confident in my faith. And he said, the Holy Spirit descended upon him in this journey he had, and he never experienced God like that before. He actually he didn't know this, but he was told later he was speaking in tongues during this process. And he said at the end, he felt like he had finally gotten his true ordination to the priesthood from this experience. And so it's like, you just sit there and you say, wow, when you sign me up, when can I get on that journey? So yeah, so all these stories just and not just the stories in this book, but I've now heard probably a couple hundred stories from people, and they almost all end in a sense of peace or healing or recovery. Most people say it's one of the top X fill in the blank, 5 experiences of their life. And so you read these stories and say, this is not a possible healing modality. Might not be for you, might not be it's certainly not for everybody, because there are some health conditions that have to be avoided. But it is another possibility, along with talk therapy, along with meditation, breath work, any way we can try to change our consciousness. That's what we're looking for. And I'm also on a little bit of a soapbox about a lot of the antidepressants, which are just purely, they're good for people. They're especially good for short-term crises. So I'm not trying to totally badmouth them at all, but for most of the people, and almost all the stories about people that have been healed through these psychedelics, one of the reasons they tried these because they felt that the antidepressants either did nothing for them or made them sort of a zombie, and they weren't living. So what was the point of living under those conditions?
Mm-hmm. Now, is it only for the purposes of healing trauma that we would look to psychedelic medicine? I know we're speaking to a group of leaders right now, right? Yep. So how would it show up and be applied to a leader's perspective?
Yes. Well, I have a couple thoughts on that. Number one, and this is something I just read about ago as I was thinking about this podcast, and they said that some of the best leaders actually had trauma in their past, and that trauma propelled them to succeed because they had to sort of beat that vision of that hurt child or whatever that was. I'm stronger than that. So there's one element, and we'll circle back around. I think one of the things that leaders are always looking for is the next big idea, the next best improvement. How can we improve our processes? What's the next product in the pipeline? And the not so secret, I guess, I didn't know about it, but it seemed like a lot of others did, is that a lot of Silicon Valley were microdosing decade ago. Steve Jobs says if it wasn't, he doesn't think all the products that he developed when he was at Apple would have been developed if he hadn't microdosed. So I think there's an element of creativity that goes with psychedelics as well. That's part of that neuroplasticity, as that you create new connections. You're like, oh wow, I never thought about that. And then when we come back around, one more point about leaders. So tied to all this is a fantastic book that I would also recommend called The Myth of Normal by Dr. Gabor Mate, who is this brilliant doctor and has been studying trauma and addiction all his life, all his adult life. And in his book, he says, we've all been traumatized. Some big T, which is, abuse, uh, war trauma, things like that. And then small t, which he labeled things, absence of love, which is sometimes accidental. We're slighted by somebody and we don't realize it, and we carry this trauma, which is why I also love the Four Agreements, because we would say, don't take it personally, but we do. Anyway, so the interesting thing about psychedelics is it does seem to clear this trauma, as well as all these other benefits of creativity, the spiritual elements. And the one fascinating thing I'll say about that is some of these war veterans that, like I said, saw the gnarliest things we wouldn't wish in our enemies' nightmares. They go into these ceremonies thinking they need to clear that trauma. And the first night, they are shown that they were traumatized as a child in whatever way it happened, and all sorts of horrible things there too. And so it's like trauma impacted on trauma, impacted on trauma. And so, yes, and I think in some ways, at least this one study shows that leaders maybe are driven to succeed partly from that early trauma. I think that psychedelics could then clear that, give them that added creativity, and push that leadership even further ahead and get to that true, what I think is important in leadership is from the employee looking up to the leadership would be authenticity. And I think psychedelics also has a way of really stripping down the ego down to some more authentic level of who you are, who that person really is inside you.
Which goes right back to where we started with Rob's quote, right?
Yeah.
Is that what the experience was like for you, Rob?
I mean, like Randall, just to share my story. So I suffered with depression since about 2012. I did various bouts of standard medication, probably around 25. And then when Susan and I were working together, I was just like stuck. And I had that OCD loop about basically suicide. And I went into trauma therapy and I did EMDR and I was doing IFS, and it was like I was doing it like twice a week for a long time, but I still wasn't feeling better. And I did another round of like 10 different medications. Some of those made me worse. And then kind of as what I thought was the last kind of attempt for me was when I found out about ketamine and how I could go to a clinic here and get it. And I went to that clinic, would have been, I believe it was July of 2021, June of 2021. And I was 53 out of 61 on the Beck's depressive inventory. And I had given up on regular medication because I was like, well, I tried 25. Why would I think anything would work at this point? Wow. And I was kind of at the end of what I thought was, it was sort of like, we'll give this a shot and then who knows, and if not, whatever, right? And I started doing ketamine treatment there, and then they put me on new medication, and it was like a switch. And it just sort of built, and like, it's just been like basically a steady upstream from there. And then obviously I've had some bumps in the road, but overall I am completely different. And a lot of the, like where we started with the quotes about programmed limitations and perceived limitations and who I thought I was fell away and was replaced by more of an authentic version of at least who I think I am today. And
fantastic.
yeah, it's been an incredible journey, and that's where we've sort of, and along that journey, right, my impact has also increased, and the leadership I've been able to do for myself and others has gone like parabolic. And I think that's where I want folks to be, is exactly what you mentioned, right? Is like everyone has gone through trauma. Now, I know because I've sat in therapy for the first 10 years, and then people go, "Did you have trauma?" I go, "No." And I was I was just unaware.
Yeah.
And it wasn't the big stuff. I didn't have big stuff, so I didn't think I had anything. But everyone's on this spectrum from 0 to 100, and it just sort of, depending on where you fall, you may be skew higher or skew lower. But I mean, Susan and I, all our leaders have some amount of it, which has caused the high achieving that we see. And so it's stripping away some of those beliefs and replacing it with others. And that's where we've gone into this route of psychedelics, is, I believe, just like you do, it's like it's another tool in the toolbox for folks out there.
Yeah, two great points to that, Rob. One is that, ketamine, while maybe not the ideal psychedelic for all things, is the only one that we can currently get legally in clinics around many states around the country. So, yeah, if you're suffering, that's a safe, legal way to go, rather than some of the other underground or having to leave the country to get treatment. And so, I love that story of yours and that healing that's going on from that. The other thing, which is funny, a lot of people say, "Oh yeah, one psychedelic journey is the equivalent of 7 years of talk therapy," and I laugh at that. But there's truth to that, because if I don't know the trauma, I can talk all day long, for years, and never clear it. So it's not the fault of the talk therapy; it's just the fault of I don't know what it is. And the psychedelics are like, "Here's the trauma in your face. Now deal with it." And so that's the advantage. And then going back to that talk therapy and be able to talk that out, that's the great part, because then you have that integration part that says, "Okay, now I understand what that trauma was. Now we can talk about it, and we can figure out how I can move beyond it."
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Like for me, I scheduled my therapist every day after my session. And so whatever came out, I would go into and do EMDR and IFS and process that. And then also, as my journey sort of shifted, because I go monthly now, but it's like basically as I've shifted from the healing of the past to kind of this new creative things, like how can I change my life? It's also about integrating those changes into your daily life. And I know this is hard, but it's like, for folks, if you go to a psychedelic retreat or you go to Mexico or Peru or wherever, right? It's like, yes, it's a great vacation, and 5 days you learn a lot, but it's really about like when you get home, how do you make the changes stick both in your mindset and also in your day to day?
Yeah. Yeah, one of the saddest stories in the book is this guy who was a complete addict of he was heroin, he was doing coke, and anything he could get his hands on, of course, alcohol as well. And he somehow had an early psychedelic experience where in this journey, during his journey, during the ceremony, the medicine told him, "You don't need these drugs. Stop it. You can heal yourself without these things." But when he got out of when next day, like you were talking about, Rob, he's with the same old people doing the same old drugs. And he actually felt worse. He felt more isolated because now he's alone. All they want to do is party. And he's like, "No, the medicine, I don't need that." But then he fell into this deeper self-loathing because now he was doing the drugs, and even though the medicine had told him not to. So I think that, the key thing I've been telling people, as you look at thinking about doing a psychedelic experience, start building that new community now before you, like we used to say, find your community after you've done the journey, but really after the journey is almost too late. You need to find it before and start building those connections up. So afterward, you have, if you don't have a therapist or a coach, you have at least other people you can talk to about the experience.
I feel like that's such a good tip, right? We were saying that this is the year of community at the start of this year on our very first podcast of the year. That takes on a whole other layer of meaning, doesn't it? But
yeah,
I want to circle back to something that you said that I know our listeners took note of. You said something about how high achievers, they're often driven to get into leadership positions, and the drive towards succeeding at that level is oftentimes from the trauma itself, which is something that Rob and I are all too familiar with working with high achievers. Know that is a very deficit mindset strategy. But then I've got to say, a lot of our listeners are probably asking, well, what happens if you heal that? What happens to my drive to succeed? And I know that this is what they're thinking because I've heard this question many times. So how would we answer that?
I think I'd love to hear your answer, but my my answer would be, and probably now I'll hear the click of the podcast over, but I've taught in business schools most of my life, and I like to ask the first day of classes to, especially my MBA students, but even my undergrads, what's your definition of success?
Mm-hmm.
Because, and of course, typical, especially the undergrads who are, and especially the male undergrads are like, yeah, have my Porsche and my $1 million by the time I'm 25. And I'm like, okay, well, to me, that's more of an outcome of success than actual success. And so, and so then I get into this whole, how do we define success? But I think, so that sort of drives my answer, because I think sometimes trauma-fueled success is success that sometimes tramples others to get there because you're so driven. You got to get there. You got to get there. I'm going to take a shortcut here. That friendship wasn't as strong as it needs to be, so that's gone, so I can get ahead. And I think what the psychedelics will do to leaders, and this would be, I would love to do a study of this. This would be so fascinating. Design some survey instruments before, and then right after, and then maybe like a couple years after. But I think what it replaces is creativity, awareness, more empathy. I mean, one outcome we haven't talked about with psychedelics is empathy, and this concern for others. And again, I think probably the best leaders have empathy going into the whole process. But I think from a psychedelic experience, it enhances even more so. For example, I feel like I have some amount of empathy before psychedelics, but people would talk about holding space. Hold space for you, and I'm like, what the heck does that even mean? Hold space, somebody, so was this some sort of woo-woo term? And we all talk about with psychedelics, but
yeah,
I had this ayahuasca experience that was not the most ideal, and there were a couple of people that were traumatized during that experience. And I was there. I determined I was there purely as a person to help these people get through that trauma, not from the medicine, but from the healer. And so I think that's what we're talking about with. So then I realized, that's what holding space is, just being there for someone and just listening to them, letting them express, emote. And I'm like, okay, well, can't we just say that rather than holding space? But anyway, that's just my little thing. But I think that's what it does. It'll make these leaders, they'll still have that drive, because it doesn't take away from the drive at all. In fact, I think from seeing just a few examples of executives that have gone through psychedelics, I see a switch, like a fire in their brains, where I have 5 new ideas for the fiscal 24 or whatever. And so I think they're going to have enhanced creativity. They're going to clear that trauma, make them more authentic leader. They're going to have more empathy, which I think is going to just make them more appreciated and beloved among their staff. So I think there's a lot of possibilities or a lot of good possibilities from it.
I love it. Yeah, we say it's pain that gets turned into purpose.
Very good. Yes.
Because I feel like that's what that is for a high achiever, is like they think it's striving, right. But it's really just surviving, we know, behind the gates. Yep. to thriving, right? Like when you're coming from a more intrinsic sense of purpose and what is meaningful in terms of what it is you're contributing to the world,
yes.
Right?
Yes.
I love it. We got to pull out the big guns before we let Randall go, don't we, Rob? Our favorite question here at the Leadership Launchpad Project is, what do you want your legacy to be? The legacy of all this wonderful education that you're doing in and around the psychedelic medicine space.
It's funny. I used to, my favorite movie that I thought represented me the most was Mr. Holland's Opus. Because that was my role as a teacher, and you never know how many people you touch until the students come back years later and say, "Oh my God, that class," or whatever. And so that was an element there. But I sort of, like I said, redefine myself broader than just professor or something like that. So I guess my quote unquote legacy would be that, if I, and it's sort of the legacy with the book as well. I'm sort of tied them together in that, I guess, if I can get, if 100 people, and I'll never know who they are, and that's fine, and I'll never know the number obviously either. But as long as some people get healed from this book, healed from my, shouting from the mountaintops as much as I can, just because, again, I think we have to fight so much of this misinformation. I was looking at a Forbes article, or Forbes posted one of their articles on LinkedIn, and it was about the study of psilocybin and alcohol abuse. And it showed, very small study, but it showed really great promise that psilocybin might be a very effective tool for reducing addiction to alcohol. And so, I liked the post, and I put a comment about it. And then, because I commented on, I got notifications. I went back and looked at some of these people, and people were like, "Oh, great, trade one drug for another." And, "Oh yeah, so I'm going to be taking mushrooms every day for the rest of my life." And it's like, oh yes, we have a big hill to climb to get to the mountaintop of truth. And that's my mission. I just want healing. All the proceeds from the book sales are going to 3 nonprofits that help in the psychedelic space. One is, of course, Heroic Hearts, because that's just dear. Veterans are so dear to my heart. Chacruna, which is protecting BIPOC and Indigenous communities, and then the Fireside Project, which is a peer support group for people during a psychedelic experience that might be having an issue and can call up and speak to someone and help calm them down. And so I just again, I don't know if I would have been this altruistic or this whatever pre-psychedelics. The one thing I did want to mention just quickly, if we have time, is also this notion of ego disillusion, or ego death, as it's sometimes called. And I don't want leaders to fear that, because in a high dosage situation, which is typically what you need for healing and maybe mystical experiences, you will have ego death. You will see that you are a speck in this crazy energy field world as you look around, but it's not ego death in the sense it doesn't come back. We couldn't survive as people if we wouldn't come back from the psychedelic experience. We'd be out there and in our mental land forever in the matrix. But what it does is it resets the ego, and so you still have that core of who you are, and that you're still going to be able to make decisions and have that personality to do that. But it just helps you see again that broader picture of the community of your entire employees, of all the stakeholders of your organization. And so and it's sort of fun for one of my mushroom experiences. When I opened my eyes, it looked like I was in a fun house. I had a little coffee cup I was drinking water from, and it looked like it was a 5-gallon pitcher, and I couldn't even pick it up and put it to my mouth. And and so I was this little person in this crazy fun house, and it was just again a little psychedelic, little kind of fun way to tell me, yeah, you're just a tiny little person here, dude. Get over yourself and find a way to be yourself and get that message out there without having to pat yourself on the back every day. And so it's good. I think again that ego resetting is a good part of psychedelics as well.
Amazing. And for everyone out there, so Triumph Over Trauma is the book. You can find it Amazon, Barnes & Noble, triumphovertraumabook.com. We've also dropped Randall's LinkedIn in the podcast notes, and you can also find his website, randallshansen.com and empoweringsites.com. Those are in the podcast notes there as well. Is there anywhere else you want folks to find you?
No, I think the best place is LinkedIn. I will just give one more little shout out to, not for mine, but one way to get community is also there are psychedelic societies across the world, but also in this country. And I would say if you're curious, find them. Most of them are on the Meetup. Just go and search for that. And that's another way of building community. But you'll find me mostly on LinkedIn.
Amazing. And for us, obviously, please hit subscribe to Leadership Launchpad Project on your favorite podcast platform. And for anything leadership development, high performance mindset, conflict management, emotional intelligence, and more, head on over to elitehighperformance.com for all of that. Susan, is there anything you want to leave folks with today?
I just feel like this is an incredibly full circle moment. You getting on here today talking about landing the TED Talk July 2nd in Japan. I don't think that we would be sitting here probably even talking about that or announcing that had we not found psychedelic medicine for you, right? So I'm just so grateful that we have people like Randall who are out there on their missions to educate us far and wide on this concept and help us heal our associations with, plant medicine. And I just think this really is taking us to the future of business, right? This is why we started the Leadership Launchpad Project, Randall, is to change the way the game's being played forever. Good. And so, this is why we feel so fervently that this psychedelic medicine needs to be a part of every leader's toolbox and repertoire.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And for me, I have a quote here from Bessel van der Kolk, and he says, trauma destroys your imagination.
Ooh.
And what psychedelics allow us to do is to heal that trauma, to open up our imagination to what's truly possible from our authentic selves. And just as Randall mentioned, and if we go back to Dr. Richard Schwartz, is we're never going to kill off these manager parts or firefighter parts that drove us to working hard and achieving and all these things. They're just going to change the way that they relate to us. And so instead of this shame-filled deficit strategy, it's going to become supportive based on impact with empathy. And as you see with me, the impact will increase and folks will gravitate towards that. And even you can you can go back to Dick's first episode and he talks about his own experience with the IFS Institute as well. So folks, thanks for listening. Randall, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me. I loved it. A great conversation. And I hope some of your audience and leaders take your advice and start looking into psychedelics as a part of their toolbox.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Everyone, thank you so much for listening. I will see you all next week.
Bye, everyone.